Hi, I'm Phil Kurz, contributing editor at TV Tech Magazine and TVTech.com. We're here today to talk about Austin PBS's new studio. This story would be interesting enough because of its design and install that put the public broadcaster squarely in the state of the art when the project began. But there's much more to the story, and we'll get into that too. Joining me today are Chris Ostertag, Chief Technology Officer at Austin PBS, John Conley, Vice President of Sales at Keycode Media, the systems integrator and reseller that worked with Chris on the project, and Harry Friedman, Senior Regional Sales Manager at Ross Video, one of the key vendors involved with the project and the sponsor of today's webinar. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. First, if you have a question, please submit it and direct it to one of our panelists. They'll get back to you after the webinar via email with an answer. Second, you'll notice there are links to additional resources for you. Feel free to click on those links at your convenience. With all that said, let's get started. Welcome, gentlemen. Chris, set the stage for us. Tell us about why it was time for Austin PBS to build out a new media center.
Oh boy! So we have existed for over 60 years, as many public media stations have. We were previously a tenant on the University of Texas campus, and we had been there for decades. And if you're in the same spot for decades, as technology grows and as the organization grows, and especially as the organization around you grows, University of Texas, eventually we and UT got to a point where we decided, it's probably time for us to find a new home, hopefully for the next 50, 60, plus years. And so we started looking many many years ago. At this point, around 2016, 17 is around when we really started engaging with the process to find a new home and find basically the future of Austin PBS, where we could grow and be flexible and continue to serve the community the way we have for the last 60 years.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the basic design considerations for the new media center was as you began the planning process?
Mm-hmm. When we plan projects, and I think as many planned projects, we don't start with what we want in the design. We start what we want with what we want out of the design. We start with what we want success to look like. And for us, being an organization that has been a pillar and part of the community for decades, and hopes to be for decades more, we really were thinking very long term with this project. We are public media. We are a small nonprofit. We're not able to really engage in large capex projects very often, and so when we do, we really need to take a very long term, far sighted strategic approach to it. So when we started thinking about it first internally and then bringing in John and his team on the discovery process, we really focused on what success would look like for our organization for the far future. And that really came down to flexibility and longevity, designing something, systems, a facility, a station, all of these things, designing things that will be as flexible as possible and can meet needs that we don't even know we need to meet right now.
So, John, Chris mentioned you and Keycode Media. Why don't you tell us about your involvement in the project?
Yeah, sure. We had Chris and I had a past history that kind of went back a ways, back to his days in Chicago. I'm based in Chicago. So once he was at Austin PBS, we reconnected, I would say, what was it, Chris, around 2015, 2016 or so.
Yeah. Yep. 15 for, yeah, we did a post production project, sort of a smaller prelude to this, what became this project. Yeah, we partnered with Keycode on a post production overhaul, getting everybody onto shared storage, which was not something that we had ever for all of our shows. So that was a nice change.
Yeah, so we kind of started there. We, as Chris mentioned, we redesigned the entire post-production workflow. They had some existing archive components, a legacy Avid system that we did some upgrades to. So that was kind of our first, I guess, step or shot at at a project with Austin PBS that was of somewhat of a significant size. And that project went well overall. We worked with them throughout the course of a couple of years to keep supporting them on that project and that infrastructure that we had implemented. And then we began kind of, and in the side, we knew that this was a project that was going to come to fruition over the next couple of years. And eventually, Chris came to us and kind of said, "Hey, we are going to start putting out soft feelers on the street for an RFP for the consulting portion of the new Austin Media Center." So that was how KeyCode got engaged, and we basically worked with Chris and submitted our consulting proposal. And then ultimately we were selected to do the full consulting and design of the facility.
So, Harry, I guess that gets to you, at least in part. I'm sure you were part of the design. I know that for a fact. Why don't you tell us about your role in the project?
Sure. Our involvement, really, I think our first correspondence started around 2018 on the project. And the things I remember early on in some of the discovery meetings were, as Chris pointed out, flexibility was a key word. And we love to hear that. And the other unique thing that struck me about the project was the location and where it was going to be on the campus now of Austin Community College. So there were some challenges with both of those. So we got involved early on. We had I think NAB meetings in 2019.
Mm.
And we continued with, I think, regular planning and design meetings, and of course, being very responsive to the project management team at KeyCode as well as the design team there. So, really in a support role, but obviously, as anyone would recognize, a trusted broadcast manufacturer. Really, it was to offer up what technology is available, what technology we feel like is on the leading edge of development, so that Chris could certainly experience that longevity that he needed in his investment.
So,
Yeah, and
Chris,
I
oh, I'm
think
sorry, excuse me.
no, I was just going to say, I think to kind of add to what Harry said, the just the overall process that we went through from the very beginning. I mean, I remember we went on site, we sat with Chris and his engineering team in a room for about a week straight and just kind of went over, it was highly collaborative, research driven. We went over their high level goals and objectives. But it obviously extended well beyond that over time. We did spend that entire NAB going around to all the various booths and manufacturers as we moved forward throughout the discovery process and the consulting process. We ended up doing multiple manufacturer shootouts where we brought in various camera manufacturers into their actual existing studio. But the biggest thing that I think that helped us be successful as a group was all the in-depth interviews that we did with the key stakeholders. So it wasn't just, "Hey, Chris, Mr. CTO, and your engineering team, what do you guys want to accomplish?" We sat down with, everybody from the engineering teams to the show producers and really focused also on the creatives. So we were able to gather a lot of information during that design and fact finding process to make sure that we were meeting both technical and the creative needs. And then as Harry mentioned, because it was a somewhat unique in being a shared facility with Austin Community College, we also engaged pretty closely with their teams to align on the shared infrastructure, because the majority of the infrastructure within the facility is shared, but they also had some unique and independent needs and educational goals and workflows of their own, right?
So, Chris, both Harry and John have talked about working with you on the planning stage of this, but even before we get into the planning stage, could you just let us know about the scope of this project in terms of what you were trying to accomplish at number of studios, control rooms, newsrooms, and all the rest?
hmm we were, fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you spin it. This was mostly a greenfield facility. I mean, we brought very little in terms of technology and workflows over from our pre-existing facility, which is, an exciting opportunity, but also, a very daunting project. Of it is, everything upgrades, everything changes. The way we described it to our board at the time was our office lighting system in the new facility is more complex than our studio lighting system at the old facility, and that sort of, sets the tone for the scope and just the jump that we made from where we were in terms of facilities and infrastructure and technology up to where we are now. So it was a dramatic step forward. We knew it would be a dramatic step forward, and that's why it was so important to us to find the right partners and to get that discovery period right.
Okay, great. Could you maybe give us a few more details? Like how big is the facility, for instance? How many
Yes.
control room studios,
hmm
etc.?
So when we started planning, there was still a lot of flexibility. So we weren't locked in, but we were roughly looking at the facility's 45,000 square foot total, and that's including both studios and office spaces. Three studios. We have three video control rooms and three audio control rooms. But back to that flexibility, the goal was to not as much as possible have a single workstation have to do a single function, or a single chair, be a single function. So any of the control rooms going into it, we knew that we wanted to ask of John and of Harry and of all the teams involved to say anywhere I am in the facility, I should be able to do most anything within the facility. That gets back to many of the conversations we had, up to and including that NAB 2019. We are also a TV station, so public media is interesting in that a lot of us are heavy producers of content, as well as traditional TV stations. So there is a large production and post production aspect to what we do, but then also the general TV station operations. So we run 4 channels, main and 3 sub channels. So we're running our main channel, Austin PBS, and then Create World and PBS Kids. Those are all run out of our facility. We're not partnered up on a JMC, so all of that was also part of this design and implementation, was moving broadcast operations over here, bringing it online, bringing everything, from ingest through automation play out to, STL out to the transmitter, in addition to all of the, high-end studio production and post-production stuff we were adding in. So really a pretty expansive scope once you get down to it.
And it just to follow on with that, so you've mentioned the desire to make the facility flexible, and today I'm guessing that you were 1080i HD, I'm guessing. And so could you discuss a little bit about the flexibility in terms of handling today's needs and where you see where things might ultimately go and how that consideration went into the design as well?
So our standard up until moving to this facility was 1080i 5994. This facility, all of the acquisition in the studios is actually done in UHD 5994.
Okay.
We're capable to go up into UHD HDR 5994. We haven't made that jump yet. But we're capable of full HD all the way up through UHD in the studio acquisition side, and have made sure that the field production side is on par with that. So as we're shooting stuff, whether in the field, whether in the studio, generally a mix of both, we're able to get the highest quality, and back to longevity, the most longevity out of that content. That is the studio side of the facility. On the broadcast operations side, because of who we are and what we do and how we tend to use our broadcast spectrum, we see a future of more content, more channels, rather than perhaps going to a UHD channel, for example, in terms of utilization. So we really designed our broadcast operations actually around a 1080p 5994 HDR high target for broadcast. We're not doing that yet because we haven't made the transition to ATSC3 yet. And depending on some stuff that's happening in the world, that may be coming sooner rather than later. But we are ready for that and ready to jump up. Right now, our high target on the broadcast side is 1080i 5994, which is pretty standard throughout PBS stations.
So, what about routing signals around the infrastructure, the new infrastructure? What was your choice there? I'm guessing that ST2110 may have been on the table at that point. I'm not sure. 12G SDI. What did you do with regard to that?
So this is one of those, we sort of have focused on some takeaways for our project, and one of them is very much focused on the importance of partnerships through discovery into implementation. But then another one is sometimes you don't get to choose your timing, right? And especially with technology. So the timing under which we were making our decisions, which to Harry's point was, our decision making trip to NAB was 2019, and then so April 2019, later in 2019, we were kind of fleshing out and finalizing that bill of materials. So that's when our decision making happened. And at that time, plus that time coupled with the physical layout of the facility, it is a single floor facility. It is pretty spread out. It didn't ultimately make sense from a design perspective as well as financially at the time for 2110. So we ended up, and that was a pretty early, we were able to do that math and see, okay, there's some stuff that with 2110 that isn't quite there enough for our comfort yet. But almost more importantly, having to almost split the facility the way we did, and we'll kind of talk in more detail how we did that. Plus the lengths we were dealing with, which we will also talk about. Plus the costs of equipment at that point and the limited number of pieces of equipment that could accomplish what we needed. It just led us to 12G. But that's not what someone else might be led to today, or even might have been led to in 2019. So that's why it's so important to do that discovery for yourself with your trusted partners, because my answer is not going to be, the right answer for potentially for other facilities.
Yeah, and I wanted to direct that to John and Harry both. So can you elaborate a little bit more on being a trusted partner and helping Chris or any potential customer walk through this process of a moving target in technology and trying to remain flexible enough to accommodate what the future might hold?
You want to start, John?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when we're having that conversation, which we have that conversation often with people, 12G versus 2110, as Chris mentioned, back then, 2110 was still maybe a little bit more expensive cost-wise. I think, the playing field has kind of been leveled at this point, 6 years later. So it's really we rather than focusing on the technology, it's kind of taking a step back and what do you want to accomplish? And in Chris's case, or certain cases where people are building a greenfield facility, you kind of have a unique opportunity that a lot of facilities or broadcasters don't have, right? So a lot of times we're walking into a facility that's saying, hey, we need a 3 to 4 year plan to transition this existing facility, and how are we going to go about doing that, right? So that's a much different conversation than, hey, we have this big budget or we got this big grant to do a complete relocation. And I think that was what was nice about this project, is we were able to kind of build that new facility in parallel with keeping the old facility in operation. Obviously, when you do the cutover, that brings up some inherent, issues that you have to deal with and logistical concerns, but it's really just focusing on what are they trying to accomplish, um, the size of the facility, the flexibility that they're looking to have. Like I said, cost really isn't a factor at this point, but we still have a lot of facilities that are doing 12G implementations where it makes sense. And then we have a lot of people that are doing phased implementations where they're saying, hey, we want to start by replacing all of the equipment in our existing studios, right? But we're not ready to replace that core routing infrastructure, right? So we can consult with them and put together a 2 3 year roadmap based on their budgets and funding, or however they're getting that money for these projects. And we can also implement technology that can future proof them and give them a path to an IP or an ST2110 facility while still keeping some of that baseband technology in play, which I think is pretty cool. A lot of the manufacturers out there have technologies that allow us to put in gateways to bring in SDI based infrastructure into IP environments and vice versa, right? So I think that's kind of the approach we take. Every client is different, every broadcaster is different. Some broadcasters are actually doing news, some are doing more of a live to tape based production, like Austin PBS. So it's really taking a look at what are their needs, and then kind of what is their budget situation, and outlining kind of a roadmap as we do go through the entire consulting process. So Harry, I don't know how you see it from your side, but that's kind of my take on it.
It's only slight. I mean, it's pretty much in line with what you're saying, but it's a little slightly different because I have to come from a manufacturer's standpoint. So first, I want to thank Phil for using the tried and true term of trusted partner. Uh, it's not a cliche. It's really important, and it's really important for somebody in Chris's position to trust the people he's working with, and to trust the information he's getting from people like John, and hopefully people like me, or companies like Ross, that we have to be in lockstep going down a path towards resolution and in this case it was building a facility of the type and the size and the quality that Chris required. And so I don't, in situations like this, you need more than a vendor. You need a partner, and I think that's first and foremost the most important thing. Also, the way that we approach it is we never want to have to say no to a customer. We always want to be able to say yes. And so Ross has always taken a multi-pronged approach. And even back in 18 and 19, it was the philosophy was let 2110 do what 2110 does well, but let SDI do what SDI does well. And so I think by offering solutions that could be, single wire 12G, as we called it at the time, uh, that provided the right approach for Chris's challenge. And uh, we could have gone any direction, really, because, like I said, we like to be able to say yes. This just happened to be the right direction for this project. And I think early on, the design team and project team at Keycode recognized this, and I think that they advised Chris very well. And I think it's evidenced in what the end result is.
So Chris, you've talked about the design phase, 2019, talked about going around to various vendors at NAB with Keycode to view various options, cameras, etc. When did work actually begin on the new facility?
Oh, so construction actually started happening prior to that, walls and, core and shell kind of work. So we were following on from the general contractor who was actually under the community college. And so we were following on with our own contractors, working, of course, really tightly with them. Some days tighter than others, of course, as any construction project goes, and we'll talk a bit about our long journey in a bit. But we started receiving deliveries in, I want to say, on-site deliveries from Keycode. So we went through, 2019, right? We did the NAB shopping trip. We kind of firmed up bill of materials through the end of 2019. We were working through sort of transitioning from design phase to build phase. As John mentioned, we did this project in 2 phases, and that was to, just to make sure to have sort of contractual moments where we could, have a forced stop and say, okay, is this all going well? And we said, yes, it's all going well. And so we commenced with phase 2, which was the build phase, which of course we continued on working with Keycode for the build phase. We had the option to not. These were separate contracts. And so we always had the option, of course, our desire is to continue. We always had the option to change things. And I think that's really important and keeps everybody aligned and on the same page. But of course we didn't. It was going really well, continued to go really well. We transitioned quickly into the construction phase. And so we basically got all the orders in, got all the lead times stuff sort of starting, got the Keycode team starting to spin up on site. Really in May, I want to say May, June 2020, which is a few months after something big happened in the whole world, which we're gonna get to. So we were still, as these massive things in the world were happening that some of you may have noticed, we were still working through that transition of design to implementation. And I very, very vividly remember as the world locked down, we were kind of right in the final stages of redlining and getting contracts back to each other, and we all had to go, uh-oh, let's get on a call because there's a wrinkle. So we kind of quickly got together and tried to just sort of add some flexibility language for back to flexibility being part of the project, because we all knew, right, as soon as the lockdown hit, we all knew that things like timetables, things like, even staff availability, were going to change and be different, and we were going to have to be flexible on the project. And back to the theme of this whole thing, trusted, partners on it, we were able to pretty quickly work together as trusted partners to all align and say, okay, we know we're going to need to be a little more flexible. We know we're going to need a little more trust in each other. And we were able to set that out really quickly and keep the project rolling, at least, in that contractual phase. And then of course we, had some more bumps in the journey, which we'll talk about. But that was basically the roll up.
Right. So, John and Harry, if you could both, kind of address this. Obviously, Chris is talking about the pandemic, and I'm sure that posed a lot of logistical challenges. I'd like you to speak to that. I also would like to get your thoughts on what were some of the bigger technical challenges that you faced, and how did you overcome them?
We
Yeah, I
all,
mean,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
Take it away, buddy.
Well, I was just going to say, we all remember the pain that I think everybody went through as the supply chains were disrupted. And that was the biggest fear. I will say that our leadership really got ahead of it. They saw what was going on in Europe and other parts of the world early on as the pandemic started to spread. And our management authorized investment in stock well ahead of the pandemic reaching, North America, and in such a level that was beyond what we normally carry in raw materials. And they said, whatever it takes, let's invest in raw materials now and get well ahead of what we think is going to be a disruption in the supply chain. It was almost like future telling, because what they predicted, or what they at least anticipated, actually occurred. And so we minimized the impact on the supply chain as much as we could. And so we never got into situations where we were 3, 4, 5, 6 months in delivery. We may have gone from normal deliveries of 3 or 4 weeks down to, out to 8 or 9 weeks. But we never really got into the situation that some people got into there. So hopefully that helped, and I think John can speak to it a little bit. Hopefully, I mean, that kept things on track as best we could by just kind of getting ahead of what we anticipated was going to happen.
John?
Yeah, and I mean, it's to just echo what everybody knows happened throughout the pandemic. I mean, not all manufacturers were as fortunate as Ross. I mean, we had scheduling issues, supply chain disruptions, slight construction delays. We had crews of people on site where obviously they're working in close quarters, so we kind of implemented some distance limitations, followed COVID protocol at the time. Um, but there were cases where I remember our lead design engineer who was on site throughout the entire project saying, "Oh, this guy got COVID, and then this guy got COVID, and we have 4 or 5 people out right now," right? So from a logistics standpoint, a project of this size is complicated in general, right? The way that we kind of handled that was we actually launched a warehouse facility and a staging facility in Austin for several years. Our lead design engineer ended up moving down to Austin to be able to manage the project, relocated and to be on site and be there for every part of the project. But yeah, I mean, logistically managing something of this caliber is very difficult, from staging and basically taking that project Gantt chart or timeline and working backwards from those target dates, and then trying to determine how are we going to stage equipment, how are we going to deliver equipment, um, when are we going to be moving things into the building, working in close contact with the GC to stay on schedule. When is the central equipment room going to be room ready for us to get into the building, right? So all of those standard logistical challenges that you face as an integrator when you're doing a project like this just got magnified by having to deal with COVID, and the pandemic layered on top of it.
Chris, I'm sure you're the customer, you want to be happy and you want to be confident, and I'm guessing that you had milestones along the way that you anticipated initially, and then COVID hit. Did you give your vendors like Ross and Keycode a little bit of flexibility as to the realities of the pandemic, came face to face with your project?
Yeah, that I mean that's always I mean as especially John will tell you, I'm acutely aware of what our contracts say and what the commitments are from every party, but you also I mean obviously you have to work within reality, and there were certain realities that we, to the point of having people get sick. There were days where entire trades would get sick because they decided to all carpool to the site together, and one of them was positive, and then suddenly everybody's quarantined for 10 days at that point, right? It was so you lose all of your electricians are out, right, for 10 days. So things like that, that was just the reality of working through this period. Also, you couldn't have staffing levels to where you would normally. You couldn't have people who didn't absolutely need to be there, like you might have, if we were not building this in a pandemic. You'd just have more people around. So there were just a ton of things that we were also dealing with, of course, as a business, because we were still operating through this whole thing in addition to building. So it was established early on that we would all have to have flexibility and trust in each other. And I think the other side of that is just making sure that everybody, because there's a lot of money involved, right? We're a small nonprofit. We had to raise this money. This is functionally the community's money at the end of the day. So our contracts also just had language, flexible language, but language around our commitments to each other. What we would do for John and for Harry, what they would do for us, what we would do if something got missed or so. So a lot of it, contracts get this sort of bad rap as people trying to get each other. A contract is really a good contract is everyone agreeing on what we're going to do together, and then we all do it. And then if something comes up, we just look at this document that says, how we handle it. And that takes some of the pressure off, actually, of okay, we're not going to hit this date what does it say? Okay, I've got to send an email to somebody. They've got to respond. I've got to approve. A lot of it was me having to write an email that said approved. Was a lot of the process. Was John saying, "Hey, this container or whatever is stuck in this factory because the factory shut down because this stuff's coming from other countries. This is a global
Right.
thing." So there's a lot of approved emails from me back to John throughout this process to deal with the reality of what this is. And I feel like all things considered, I think this project went amazingly well. Objectively, as far as projects go, it was a very long, very difficult project. But given everything we were faced with, I still do think that this came out the best it possibly could, given all of the multiple things that were stacked against it throughout the years, candidly.
So the other part of that question was, what were some of the biggest technical challenges you faced? And let's just all three of you please comment.
Who wants
I
to
mean,
start?
I can kind of kick it off, and then Chris, because you're the technical guy and I'm just the sales guy. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that we encountered technically, we have about 100, what is it, 100 miles of 12G cable running throughout the facility. So at that time, we were we were going off the SMPTE spec and the spec of 12G cable runs and distances, and we were obviously, as you would, giving ourselves a lot of headroom there. And I think throughout the process we realized that um, the what the published spec, I guess, at the time was from the various cable manufacturers, um, was not entirely accurate, and which led us into having to do some changes, introducing fiber into the facility in certain situations, and then doing extensive signal testing, using different cable manufacturers. And um, I see that as technically one of the largest issues that we encountered as we were, going through the initial deployment. But
And
Chris,
it,
you
it was
have
yeah,
ex-
it was a multi-layered issue as well, because at first, as we started encountering issues, because the low voltage contractor was under the general contractor, and we were providing basically a project manual for here's how to run low voltage. You have to meet these specs. Here's the links to the specs. You can't exceed these distances, right? We had the distance charts for all the different signals and cable types we were using, and so they ran all of it. And as we started testing things started failing. And first problem we identified was the low voltage contractor didn't actually measure the cables they ran, which is sort of a key problem number one, right? So we started addressing that. We started looking at the run routes they took versus the run routes that were designed by the architects and by the GC, um, and started looking at what we had to redo. But then as testing continued, we realized that, some of the ones that are still within the length, even when they're run differently, they're also failing. And that was the point where we all said, "Oh boy, this is a thing." And we stopped, I think, for about a month, and really just went back to that warehouse that John mentioned, and just did the work of on the ground testing of, okay, we're at 100 feet, it works. We're at 110 feet, it works. We're at 115 feet, it doesn't work. Okay, let's change. Just identifying variables and changing them out. Another thing we discovered with 12G is it is much more device dependent than 3G, than we were used to having in 3G. The same exact cable run would pass on certain devices connected on either end and fail on other devices connected on either end. So it was really discovering that there was a looseness to the 12G spec that is not something we were used to dealing with previously in the 3G spec. We had never dealt with 6G, so that wasn't really a thing. So that was probably, I would say, the biggest, that sort of multi-layered 12G cable length plus spec discovery process was very fun.
and what would you say, Chris, in the end was kind of the final decision on how much headroom to give based on the published spec.
I mean, on the cable itself, I want to say it's somewhere in the 30%, depending on the cable. We also had some requirements from the college, so we had to use, in certain cases, we had to use plenum cable, even if it wouldn't have been called for. It was a requirement of the college. So there were spaces that were not plenum spaces that we had to run plenum cable through anyway. And that's a constraint of this 13 campus behemoth that we're not getting that changed. So we're just going to work within it. But yeah, somewhere in the 30%, but then to the point of it is also device specific. So I remember we did have some devices where, it was even a 40% loss, 40% below what the published length spec was. So we ended up just going with the biggest, heaviest stuff we could run and as much as we could afford. And then we layered in, to John's point, we layered in some fiber. We also layered in some reclocking basically units from Norwea that were actually a circuit that was initially, I'm going to paraphrase this wrong, but I'll get close enough. Initially part of what Utah does in their 12G routers, or at least did back in 2019, 2020. And they pulled that circuit out and sold these boxes, just these little boxes that just do this one thing separately. And I'm sure there's lots more options nowadays, but at that time, that was the solution, was pull a circuit, turn it into a product, put in 50 of them or whatever we needed for the longest runs.
Harry, did you have anything you wanted to add about the technical challenges with the project?
No, I like to think that maybe what we provided was less challenging than the cable answer, because that seemed to be a real headache. I think, like I said early on, we love to hear when a customer requirement is maximum flexibility, because I think as a manufacturer, we like to provide product that offers as much flexibility as possible. And that was certainly a challenge to overcome, but I think we all got together and overcame it well. But the ability to control any studio from any control room was a requirement early in the discussion, and so it wasn't a surprise. We addressed it early on and overcame that obstacle pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I will say and I would say this without Harry on the line or without Ross sponsoring the event. I think Ross was the least of our concerns throughout the course of the project as far as the technical side was concerned.
So, Chris, when did the project wrap up?
Oh yeah, there's so many asterisks, right? But really, our final acceptance of commissioned project was February 2024. And so if you remember the dates I've thrown out, right, my first meetings were in August 2017 and finished February 2024. A lot of stuff happened in those middle times.
But the marketing piece was just released, so maybe you can consider that a milestone.
Right?
Here we are in 2025 talking about something that started in 2019, right?
Yeah.
A lot that brought us to that point, right?
Yeah.
So
It wasn't just COVID, but there was something else that was unforeseen that happened that maybe delayed the project. Do you want to tell us about that, Chris?
Yeah. So we just tried to put all of the large mountains to climb on one project. We really just wanted to, have a big old story to tell.
And remind people this is South Texas.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. We are in Texas. Remember, Austin, Texas, as I tell this story. So we had been working through the pandemic, and we were getting to where the facility was 1 week out from certificate of occupancy. And this was February 2021. And we were still a few months away. I think at that point, I try not to think about the milestones that were the previous milestones for obvious reasons. But I think at that point in February 21, we were projecting a, probably early Q4 21 wrap up of the project and being able to come online. A week before certificate of occupancy, we had the first of what ended up being two big Texas freezes in a relatively short period of time. And so ton of snow dumped on Texas, specifically Central Texas. Temperatures got really cold. Everything froze. Texas is not at all prepared for this kind of weather, and especially wasn't then. So we lost water service, we lost power, we lost natural gas. So we're losing any of the backup generators of natural gas. We're losing those as well because the gas froze. The facilities froze. Again, we're in Texas. So I got a text, and this impacted, of course, everybody. We all live here. We're a community organization. So not only is the facility cold and frozen, but our houses are cold and frozen. Most of us are without power, without water. This is also during COVID. Still, this is before the vaccine, right? So there aren't the options that you would have normally in a disaster like this of congregating where there's heat and where there's water and all that, because there's also an airborne pandemic happening. So I got a text the first day I was, I think, without power after that weekend. It was kind of a weekend of storms, and then everybody kind of picked up, Sunday into Monday. And what it turns out happened on Sunday was the building lost water. The water in the existing pipes froze and ruptured the pipes. And then as everything melted and the water came back on, it just started dumping. And I think it was 2 3-inch pipes, feeder pipes into the building that were by the studios that just dumped water for about 8 hours before the community college police department noticed that, oh, there's a lot of water in here, because they have 13 campuses, and they're doing disaster recovery. So they caught it, called building management, called everybody. And I got a text actually because Keycode was on the ground as well. Their crews had gotten back into the building, and I got a text from the lead engineer that basically was like, "Happy Monday," and a picture of the flooded facility. Give me a call. And so he was in Mexico at the time because he was on a trip with his wife. So he stepped off the beach and started making some calls, and I got on with him, and we just kind of got to work on, okay, what do we got now? And just got to work on what's the extent? How bad is it? I mean, it was pretty bad, right? Certificate of occupancy was about to be granted. So most of the equipment was on site. Much of it was powered on and running in racks. And we had, I want to say 1 to 2 inches throughout, I don't know, 44,000 square foot of the 45,000 square foot facility by the time it was caught and turned off and all that. So tremendously extensive. Tons and tons of just wet carpet got pulled out of that facility. Just a brutally extensive disaster that we then got to work on solving.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about your game plan for tackling this situation?
Oh, I mean, the initial was just start documenting, right? It like the first, like literally that day I had, I had a lot of pictures being taken, mostly by the Keycode crew, but also by Austin PBS staff. I had also, back to the sort of preternatural foresight kind of thing that Harry mentioned, I had stocked up on humidity sensors for some reason. And so I had and they were at my house because at the time we didn't have an office. We didn't have this built yet. Our old facility we had to move out of, I think about a year prior. So it was full on home. So I had a lot of equipment at my house. So I had humidity sensors, and I had some of the crew pick them up from my house and start monitoring. It was about hourly monitoring of these rooms, what the humidity is and what the water level is, and also start trying to pull stuff out as quickly as we can. We actually started with not the new stuff, but the oldest stuff. Not only do we have this new stuff, some of the stuff that came over previously was like 1-inch tape machines, things like that from back in the day that we still use because Austin City Limits has been around for 50 years now, and we still have some of those tapes that we do have to run every now and then. So, and that's irreplaceable basically at this point. So we actually first went for the retro stuff, pulled that out, got that offsite and kind of warming up and drying out, and then started looking at everything else and, documenting, is it humidity damage? Is it direct water damage? Because most of it was humidity damage, but some of it also did have direct contact with water if things were stored on the ground. So just tremendous amount of documentation over the next, I would say, 2+ weeks, because it was very hard to dry out the facility given everything that, we had to take down. Most of the walls had to be cut, 4 or 5 feet up. Carpet had to be removed, furniture had to be removed. So the remediation process just to get the facility to a humidity at 60 or below was weeks.
So, John and Harry, from your perspective, how do you go about working with a client who has faced, just a tremendous disaster like this? I'm sure there are lots of things that go through your head and issues that have to be dealt with. Why don't you, tell us what some of those are and how you approached it?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, I'll I'll never forget that I got, or the day that I got the same call that Chris did. Um, and it was a massive shock, obviously. Um, I like to think that from an integrator perspective, from a partnership perspective, we we didn't skip a beat. We didn't sit there and say, "Oh, Chris, we need to take a step back and, all of this remediation isn't part of our scope." It was just like, "Hey, we'll figure all this out later. We got to get moving right alongside you guys, right?" So, um, our teams just worked alongside the Austin PBS team to inspect uh, the equipment. As Chris said, it was a lot of it, I think, was more humidity and moisture related than it was necessarily being uh, directly water damaged. So we worked, obviously, a facility this size has endless manufacturers involved in putting the facility together, right? So it was first alerting all of them as to what happened, um, looking through what their potential RMA process would be, how they would handle the remediation process, what's covered under insurance, what isn't, what can we swap out. Um, and I think we just went through and cross-checked every piece of equipment along the way, as Chris said, starting with some of the older stuff that came over from the old facility. And along the way, some of the equipment was sent back to specific manufacturers, and they put it through extensive testing to see if they could recertify it and continue on with the warranty, or if it needed to be replaced. So that was a big process in general for everybody involved, right? So, and then the big thing was the cabling too, right, Chris?
Oh yeah, so cabling, for those who don't know, the cabling you're using indoors looks like it's waterproof. It's not waterproof. It is actually, it's very good at wicking water along the length of the cable. So it was an interesting confluence of problems fighting each other, because we had the length problems of the 12G, and we had problems of the low voltage contractor hadn't run the wires, where they were supposed to, along the length they were supposed to. So we had been starting to work that out. But then we had an event that required all of the wires to be rerun. So it's like this argument is moot now, because now we have to have this very different, much bigger conversation. So I don't want to call it a silver lining, because it's just different versions of bad. But two big waves kind of hit each other, and maybe they work out to a smaller wave. It's kind of some of that happened. But yeah, we did. So that 100 miles that John mentioned, that got run functionally twice, because we had just, the cable, it was to a point where we did some testing, and we did some, cutting open some cable and really doing the moisture testing. And really it was, is this worth always wondering if our infrastructure is, slowly corroding on the inside? It wasn't. It ended up not being. And so that was something that pretty early on, we and ACC, because there's a lot more cable than just us, right? We kind of came together and said, all right, this low volt, we're not going to mess around with this low voltage. This is, we're going to be using this for decades to come, probably, given that we're both nonprofits. So we need to really get that right. So yeah, we ran it all again. Second time was contracted out to KeyCode, under the general contractor, and so they knew to measure it, which is nice.
Right. Harry, I'm curious what the perspective of a manufacturer is when you have a customer that's facing something
Yeah,
like this.
it first thing, it was it was pretty much a surprise. Chris mentioned all of those of us that lived in Texas lived through that winter event. I live in North Texas, so it was not a big surprise here, but I had friends that lost power and lost water and had damage to their garages and everything, but I never expected for it to reach down to Austin. And I got that call as well after the weekend. And here are pictures of those moisture meters, with unusual, and there is nothing that broadcast electronics likes about heat and moisture. So we simply said, what do we need to do? What can we do for you? How can we help? And that's what you do. You don't qualify it. You just open your arms and you say, what do you need? And John and the engineering crew on site said, stand by. We're going to look at what the damage is. We're going to evaluate what the real impact is, and we'll let you know what we are going to require. From a manufacturing standpoint, it came down to providing the right documentation for Keycode and for Chris to substantiate the damage to I'm going to assume the insurance companies, and what was going to be required to say, hey, we manufacture this stuff. We don't think it's going to like heat and moisture. It's been exposed to heat and moisture. And so we needed to provide the documentation that proved that it would have a detrimental impact on the products itself. So we lined all of that up. We got the wording that was acceptable to PBS and to the insurance company, and provided all of that support documentation. John and the Keycode crew knew it, explored the RMA process. We put that in place. We said whatever needs to come back. Here are the RMAs. We prepped as though we were going to have to take it all back and replace it. And in the end, I think it was really very little material from Ross, at least, that had to be replaced in the end. But like I said, you just have to stand by and say, whatever you need in a crisis like this, we're here to support you.
Yeah. And the replacement point, there was also the trickiness back to the supply chain issues, right? There were some things,
Right.
there were some things that we were able to get, replaced due to insurance money. There's some things that we weren't able to, that we, had to go through maybe a repair or replace process. But especially for the replace process, had we had to replace everything, or had / been able to replace everything, it might not have been the right choice for the project, because it would have pushed us back even further on deploying, because stuff just wasn't available, right? Things had slowed down pretty tremendously at that point. We actually had, during the flood, while we were doing the remediation and going through everything and making sure it still worked, we had some manufacturers reaching out to ask if they could buy back that stock, because they were so short elsewhere on trying to sell some stuff. It wasn't Ross, but other manufacturers. It was very dire globally. And so, some of it was a little bit of a mixed blessing to, some of the stuff that we didn't have to reorder, repurchase, because frankly, we couldn't have.
So, Chris, when when did you finally cut the ribbon on this facility, and you're up and running with it? Last year, right? In 2024 sometime?
So we continued work on it after we moved in and after we started working. So it was kind of a phased move in. We
Okay.
completed, really the last stuff to complete was the studio production side of the facility. And so we focused, and that was part of the remediation as well, is working with John and with Harry on saying, okay, here's an order of operations, because we need to get into the facility. We need to put staff in there. We need to start broadcasting from there, because we're losing our lease on our old facility. So we really focused, as we were going through that remediation, on prioritizing broadcast operations and getting the core sort of master control up and running first, and then going out to, the office spaces and finally the production spaces. So we cut over broadcasting March 21st of 2022, which is little over a year after the ice incident. And there, ton of remediation, ton of reordering, ton of reinstalling and recommissioning and we did things a lot on this project multiple times as things came up. So that was kind of the start of our of cutting the ribbon, was March 2022. And we continued on. Obviously, really the only people in the building at that point were the engineers and the broadcast ops people. Started bringing in more staff, started bringing the rest of the facility online. For general offices, post-production, we started bringing online. Editing at people's houses had been pretty rough for a few years, and so wanted to get them off that. And then finally, we had a grand opening actually in August 2023, where everything was done except for our ability to produce shows out of the studios. So the studios themselves, like for an event venue, seating and lighting and sound and all that was done and commissioned enough to use. But we were still working on commissioning the production systems, the camera switchers, all that, and getting folks trained. Back to the point of how big a jump in technology and complexity it was. It was a good amount of time to get people up to speed on using these facilities and being able to produce shows. So we had a big grand opening gala in August 23, and then continued, on finishing up the studio side of the work, which finished up in February 24.
Okay, great. We are about out of time here, so I just want to give you each just 30 seconds. We talked about this whole theme of trusted partners, a big project like this with a lot of unforeseen delays and circumstances. Tell me about that trust factor and how that played into, the ultimate success of Austin PBS's new studio.
I can, excuse me, give me a sec. So I think it's for us, as especially as a community organization, a mission driven organization, it's core to what we do. We seek out partners in everything we do, and this was no exception. And so I think to be able to deliver this amazing space, this amazing opportunity, this amazing resource to the community, we couldn't have done this without trusted partners, even without all of the trials and tribulations. And of course, as we got through the trials and tribulations, we saw again and again the importance of those trusted partners. And that's what we tell anyone who asks us what our one takeaway from this project is you are looking for partners. You are not looking for vendors. That will never steer you wrong.
John, Harry, anything to add?
I think, I mean, as Chris went back to just talking about the contract and things like that, and the multiple amendments we had to make to it, I think it's just having a mutual understanding, having a good relationship, a good rapport, keeping in constant contact, and being flexible with each other, right? We had to push back dates and amend that contract multiple times, and we both had the understanding that a lot of this was outside of our control. I think from a key code perspective, we learned a lot. As I said, building facilities of this scale are difficult without giant hurdles that we have to overcome, right? So it's even funny, we're looking at other, we're doing other PBS station builds, and one's currently going on in Tucson right now, and we were kind of joking the other day, we're like, well, at least there's, it's warm there. There won't be a freeze in Tucson. If there is, you never know. So it's caused us, I guess, to kind of take a step back and look at all sorts of different aspects of the project. What can go wrong? What can go sideways? We learned a lot. And in the end, as Chris said, it's just having good partners, having good manufacturer partners that have our back, because ultimately, when things like this happen, we're going back to the Harrys of the world, the Rosses of the world, and saying, hey, help. And that's what's most important, I think, is just having a good relationship with the customer, a good understanding, being flexible on both sides, and then as an integrator, having a good relationship with your partners.
Harry, I'll give you the last word.
Wow. I'm just going to remind people that are watching or listening that trust is a two-way street. And I think that's very important in relationships like this. I know that when Chris commits to doing something, he's going to do it. We have a long relationship with Keycode and with John, and we know that when they give us a spec or when they design a system, that it is solid and we don't have to second guess what they're doing. And so that's one direction. The other direction is for us as a manufacturer to provide the solutions and the technologies and the support that we promise that we're going to provide. So I think it's that two-way trust that is most important. And I always say, you know, when everything goes great, everything is smooth, um, you don't put pressure on anybody to perform because everything happens the way it's supposed to. But when you have situations like what we ran into a couple of times in this project, your partners and your trusted partners are even more vital because they have to perform and they have to do what they say they're going to do. I think certainly Kiko did. I like to think that Ross did. And again, I'm going to point to the facility and the success that Chris has had there as evidence that in this case, trust worked.
Well, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank our panelists, Chris Ostertag, John Conley, and Harry Friedman, for being here to tell us about the Austin PBS project. I also want to remind you to check out my stories and those of my colleagues at tvtech.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.